Here I am with Kevin Maurer.
And we're going to be talking about Luther's Sola Fide.
Yeah. Well, first, Lucas, I just got to say, I'm a big fan of your show. Been following your work for years, and such an honor to finally make it on your show. It's great.
Thank you. You know what? I just realized is I don't have any coffee. I should probably go get some coffee. So
yeah. That's probably a good time to say this episode is sponsored by Cafe Ibis.
Yeah, while you're saying that, I'll go get the coffee.
Great. Cafe Ibis, roasted locally in Logan, Utah. Cafe Ibis, bad and bitter, yum. I actually really like it. Got it out. Gonna get some more myself. It's a pretty good coffee.
That wasn't the most strange intro I've ever done.
Oh, are you gonna edit what you just said?
I don't think so.
We'll see.
This is gonna be theology raw.
Raw theology. This is what they don't tell you in school, kids.
That even when you grow up and get old and have gray hairs, you still talk theology.
Do you have any gray hairs?
I've got like one right. You see that?
Okay, yeah.
Right there, and there's like a couple more showing up.
Sure, yeah. I myself, I think I've got two that I've identified.
I'm progressively naming them after students. So
Anybody who will be watching this who has a gray hair named after them?
I don't want to humiliate them yet. Okay. Usually, it's whenever a student asks or says like, "Hey, you have a gray hair," that I'm like, "Yeah, I named it after you."
Its name is Billy.
Name. Yep. But yeah, we're here today because Kevin and I are roommates, and so he's kind of joined me in this journey, or at least listened to me talk a lot about the videos. And
I, unlike a lot of you, probably, I actually get the jokes that are in the videos. So I hold Lucas's videos in much higher esteem than probably a lot of you do.
Especially that Shepherd of Hermas.
That was a good one. If you don't get it, too bad.
Yeah.
It was good.
But the other day we were talking a little bit about Luther, and Kevin brought up, you brought up to me that you were raised Protestant and became Catholic. So we had a really good conversation. And I thought, this would be actually kind of a fun thing to record. Because I was raised Catholic my whole life. I've done a lot of studying on Luther, and I'm like very fascinated by him, and like the idea of like Sola Fide and all of that. And I've had a lot of debates with friends, but I've never like actually had to like live it or like so. There's kind of a disconnect in terms of like I have it in the intellect, but I never actually like lived it. So I guess I wanted to start out and ask like, tell me a little bit about your backstory.
Yeah, well, on that note, I really grew up admiring Luther a lot. I was kind of told growing up that Luther had sort of saved the church from itself. It kind of recovered the true gospel, and not too unlike the idea of the restoration of the gospel that Latter-day Saints have. So I really grew up kind of with all of those assumptions, and it was around the time I was your age, like when I was in high school, it would have been really hard for me to conceive that Luther was anything but a completely heroic, holy man, So, my family actually was Catholic until I was about 9 years old. We left the Catholic Church then, and we just kind of went on this journey, sort of from church to church, and I would say I grew up with a really strong faith, actually, even though we weren't quite sure where we were gonna land on everything. But really, the Bible was very central to my upbringing when I was a kid, and I think Luther would have been proud of that. I mean that was kind of a fruit of what he had fought for during his lifetime. He wanted everybody to read the Bible, and my parents grew up Catholic in a culture in which, Catholics often didn't read the Bible all that much, and so from their experience, they viewed Protestantism as kind of the true guardians of the Bible, and that was their experience. And as I got older, I realized that was kind of a limited experience and doesn't really capture the fullness of history and reality.
Yeah. It's interesting. I grew up Catholic, not necessarily in the strongest practicing family, and so I'm like, not a lot of my family actually practices the faith. But I was thinking about it. I was like, when did I first read the Bible on my own? Like, when did I first literally pick it up and be like, I'm going to read this by myself? I think I was a junior in high school, the first time I ever read the Bible by myself. Yeah. Which I hate that stereotype, and I hate that it's true. That we're not great at reading scripture.
Yeah, and honestly, I came back to the Catholic faith in part by reading the Bible, and in the Bible I found Catholic teaching. I found huge swaths of the Bible that were overlooked when I was growing up, even though all of the churches that I attended really preached that the Bible is the sole authority. There were parts of the Bible that we just didn't really read much, but if we had read them, it would have, brought us to a much more Catholic theology. In particular, it sounds crazy to say, but the Gospels, which are so central to Catholic practice. When you go to Mass, right? The Gospel is the summit, it's the pinnacle of the liturgy of the Word during Mass. I grew up reading the epistles of Paul a lot, and books of the Old Testament, but and I had a general idea of the outline of the Gospels, but there were so many teachings in the Gospels that I didn't know, that I had never read before.
It's really funny. When I first started reading scripture by myself, I was like, all right, I think I want to be this Catholic thing. And because I was like, I think I want to be this Catholic, that means I can't be this Protestants, because, I grew up thinking well, Catholics have to hate Protestants and Protestants have to hate Catholics, which is a problem.
Did you grow up around a lot of Protestants?
So my mom's side of the family is actually Lutheran. Okay. Whole mom's side. But granted, they're also not particularly practicing. I'm kind of a black sheep in my family. Yeah. But when I was reading scripture, I was like, I'm just gonna read the Gospels, and I was afraid to read Paul's letters, because I was like, man, if I read Paul's letters, I might become a Protestant. Which is really a shame, because I read Paul's letters later, and I'm like, these are beautiful.
They are. Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Absolutely.
And it's been really interesting, because I've my life I've become good friends with a couple of my close friends are Lutherans, and one's actually non-denominational. So I've really grown kind of an appreciation for Catholics and Protestants really shouldn't hate each other. I don't like that.
Absolutely.
But yet and this is one of the hard things with it is, and this is what I've really appreciated with the friends I've had, is we recognize that just that Catholics and Protestants, we desire to be together. We desire to be one body, but we also do have theological differences, and it's actually really a sign of maturity if you can acknowledge this and actually have that conversation. And I appreciated one of my good friends who I've actually thought about having a meeting with him like this just to chat. I appreciated that he straight up said, I think you're wrong, and here's why. Yeah. And I was like, thank you, let's talk.
Yeah. Unity is never accomplished by pretending that we don't have differences and sweeping them under the rug. Unity is accomplished by acknowledging our differences and wrestling with them, and being open to hearing another side, but also trying to convince the other person in good faith.
Right. Yeah. So what I want to do, kind of with the rest of this interview, is I want to have a discussion on Luther's Sola Fide, so faith alone. So I didn't really get to cover it in my video, but I thought we just kind of talk about like what is it, slash how did you understand it, slash how does Luther actually understand it, if there was a disconnect there, and then finally kind of talk about why as Catholics we're not completely on board with Sola Fide.
Yeah.
And this, I think this would be a really fascinating conversation. So starting off, what's Sola Fide?
Sola Fide is Latin for faith alone. And Luther, he kind of came up in this really rigorous tradition. And we've kind of discussed how maybe he personally struggled with just being racked with guilt and kind of had an unhealthy approach to God in his own spiritual life. And he was an Augustinian monk, and he read certain passages, especially in Paul's epistles to the Romans and the Galatians, which he interpreted as faith being an intellectual assent to a truth is solely what saves us. And so there are the saved and there are the unsaved. Those who are saved are those who consider a truth of the gospel, namely that Jesus Christ is Lord, died for our sins, etc. And by assenting to that, I am performing my salvation. God is performing that salvation for me.
And so a lot of times, just kind of add on this. So here's Sola Fide, and a lot of times the pushback from the Catholic side is we don't say faith alone, we say faith in works. Why is Luther worried about works being part of our salvation?
Well, there's one level in which we could maybe psychoanalyze him and wonder why it was so difficult for him personally to view works as being part of salvation. And that's very speculative, but it could have something to do with just feeling always to being on the precipice of hell, right? Just if he messes up at all, he thinks God is going to send him to hell. Maybe he thought that as a Catholic, and was very nervous about that. And just an aside, I think that many Catholics actually of a certain age, not being well formed, not having really learned the gospel very well growing up, all the stereotypes of the really mean nuns in school and etc. I think a lot of Catholics of a certain age did grow up with that mentality too, and so reading the words of Paul saying, "It is by faith that we're saved, not by works of the law." That may seem very liberating in a way that we can now just throw away all kind of accounting of our rights and our wrongs, and now just the fact that I believe this is enough for my salvation. So that's kind of on a psychological level, but I think the text that he was engaged with specifically were those passages in Romans and in Galatians where Paul is really speaking to Gentile communities, making sure they know that they don't have to become Jews in order to be Christians, right? And so he says it's not by works of the law of the Torah, the Jewish law, that we are saved. It's by our faith, which is the Christian faith is a new way. It's a new way in which the greatest commandment is love. So I think that's what Luther saw. I think that's what Luther latched onto.
And I think it makes sense. One of my favorite verses in Paul is where he says, like, I don't understand myself. right? I always do what I don't want to do, and I never do the good that I want to do.
Yeah.
Right. And I think Luther's keyed onto something which is always been in the tradition, which is going against Pelagianism, right?
Yeah.
That idea that like if I just work hard enough, I can earn salvation.
Yeah.
That like God is just some accountant judge up there who says if you have a positive amount of good works versus the bad works you did, then you're in. And it gets rid of the whole like relationship aspect. That like Christianity is not like, it is a religion, but at the heart of it, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
And that if we just turn it into like, if I just do enough good things, that I've stopped caring about my relationship with Jesus, and instead I'm just trying to like earn His love,
right? Which
I can't earn.
Yeah.
Right? I've already got it.
That, and it also diminishes the sovereignty of God.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Pelagianism is a heresy. It takes away God's sovereignty and it puts it on us.
Right.
And we can, through our own strength of will or whatever, we can attain to God's level. Yeah.
And I think if anyone's really honest with yourself, Pelagianism essentially says heaven is your work, and if you get there, it was because you did it. But what that also means is the flip side, that hell is your fault completely. And if we're honest with ourselves, I'm not as good as I think I am.
Yeah.
Which, you know, some will be like, you know, feel good about yourself. And, you know, I want to feel honest about myself. I want to have a sort of humility and be like, let's recognize my actual faults and then try and like grow in them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something like admirable there about Luther, because he is trying to push back about against, you know, sort of a reforming of Pelagianism. And I think the other thing, and this is one place where I find that, and this took me a while to figure out, that Catholics tend to caricature Luther and say faith alone means you don't have to do anything good, that you suddenly believe in Jesus and then you can sit back and go and kill as many people as you want as long as you have faith. And that's not exactly what he's saying, because he still thinks you do good deeds, but his argument isn't you do good deeds in order to be saved. Yeah. It's because you're saved that you go and do those good deeds, but they don't do anything more.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the idea that Luther and the Catholic Church of his time were sometimes talking past each other. At least part of it was due to misunderstanding, maybe semantics. And the 1999 joint statement on salvation from a bunch of Lutherans and the Catholic Church tried to kind of put some of those things to rest. You know, that we're, to an extent, we're saying the same thing. There are real differences, but some of those differences can be resolved just by pointing out semantic differences.
My friend Davis and I traveled we did a number of different like 10-day trips, backpacking trips throughout Europe. And one of them, we had this like massive, like, it literally started in Germany, which is kind of ironic. We started debating like this idea of faith and works and like, you know, scripture and all that, you know, the classic Protestant Catholic talking points. And we started in Germany, and we had this just massive debate, and we actually kind of got mad at each other, and we had to like take a break from it. And it was kind of ironic because we were close to where the Reformation started. And we go through all these different places in Europe, and 10 days later, we're in Amsterdam. And we finally like have this breakthrough, and we look at each other, and we're like, a lot of our arguments have been against the fringes of each other's faiths, right? A lot of his arguments were against Catholics who didn't care about Jesus and just tried to earn salvation. A lot of my arguments were about Protestants who just seem to only like have faith and not actually do anything with their faith. Yeah. And we both looked at each other and were like, turns out we just hate lukewarmness in each other's faiths. And like, let's actually like get at real practicing people.
Yeah.
And it was a big breakthrough, because a lot of it really is semantics, because we do kind of form a different vocabulary.
Yeah, and on that point, it is notable that the confessional Lutherans, the really kind of hardcore traditionalist Lutherans, did not sign this joint statement on salvation. It was more mainstream Lutherans who signed on to it. So I don't know. There are Lutherans anyway that don't, that go much further in the extreme and wouldn't agree with what was said in that statement.
Right. Well, let's talk about, so what was it kind of like, growing up with faith alone, and then why do you not agree with faith alone, I guess?
Yeah, well, so, and I grew up, I didn't have the words. I didn't know the word Pelagianism, for example. I didn't
know that word till college.
Mr. Steffensmeyer's theology class when I was a kid, unfortunately. So yeah, I didn't know about Pelagianism, but implicitly I thought that the Catholic Church taught Pelagianism. That just this idea that you can earn salvation. That's why Catholics were. Even I would hear things when it's as far as that Catholics were not Christians. I think I kind of believed that for a time. Catholics aren't Christians because they think you can earn your salvation. They don't believe that Christ died for our sins.
I will say, as a lukewarm Catholic in high school, my goal was not so much to earn my salvation, it was just to barely get to purgatory.
And that's a worthy goal.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was bad.
Easier said than done.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just an aside too, Thomas Merton made a really great point in the Seven-Story Mountain. Great book. All of you kind of going into college and wrestling with your faith, I really recommend the Seven-Story Mountain. Really good book. But he says when he first became Catholic, his main goal was to not go to hell. And but he realized, so I'm gonna continue in the Catholic faith, and I'm just gonna not commit a mortal sin. But he realized really quickly, if your goal is to not commit a mortal sin, it's inevitable that you'll commit a mortal sin, right? So you have to strive for something much higher than that. And Pope Francis said recently, if you're not progressing in your spiritual life, you're inevitably regressing. If you're not going forward, you're going backwards. And Bob Dylan once said, he not busy being born is busy dying. So beautiful. Get busy being born. Anyway, where were we?
I think we were about to talk about faith, what it was like growing up faith alone.
Yeah.
Before we do that, see, my laptop's almost out of memory, so I'm going to quickly go grab my external hard drive, and let's restart this in 1 minute.
Sounds good.
All right, we're back at it. I've got my external hard drive plugged in, and let's finish this interview up. So where we last were talking about faith alone. So kind of what was it like? How was it taught to you? How did you understand it? And then what eventually, maybe why did you become Catholic? Or I eventually want to get it I want to get at a charitable what is faith alone, but then also get at a very real why Catholicism doesn't fully agree with it.
Yeah. We were talking the other day about how what the Catholic Church would call a heresy, every heresy has so much truth in it, but it's not the full truth. And so I think that you made a great point a minute ago about Pelagianism. The Protestantism that I encountered when I was growing up was very anti-Pelagian, which is a good thing.
Heretics.
If we stop there, that would be great, because Pelagianism is a heresy, and I grew up with a very healthy understanding that I can't earn God's love, I can't earn salvation, and that's a great foundation for the Catholic faith. But really, I think it just didn't go far enough. As a heresy, it fixated on a certain truth and it excluded all other truths. The reality is that in the Catholic view, we're saved by faith, which encompasses our works as well. We express our faith through our works, and our behavior, our entire wills are expressions of faith. So I think Luther's issue was that he diminished the word faith. He boiled it down to a very simplistic understanding of kind of intellectual assent. If I believe something in my heart or in my mind, that's how I am saved. But from a Catholic view, that's just a very restricted and limited view of what faith is.
You know, it's interesting because probably the day, I don't know what specific day, but the day that changed my life was the day I realized that you can have a relationship with God, and God isn't just something to be proved. Because most of my actually middle school and early high school career, I was raised Catholic, and my one goal in life was, before I actually do this Catholic thing, I need to prove with certainty that God exists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did all of this debating online and all of this discussion, and what I ended up coming down with is that there's wonderful arguments against God's existence, and there's arguments for, and I really couldn't find one that was definitive, that like fully showed one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And then I suddenly had this day where I realized, is the only thing God's there for is to exist? And then someone suddenly realized that, like, faith isn't just believing God exists. Faith is getting to know God.
Yeah.
Which to some extent, I had that same idea that, like, a lot of times when people say faith, they just think it's just an intellectual assent without any proof whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say people of faith, that is not at all what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about, like, this trust in this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll also say that a very positive thing about the Protestantism that I grew up in is that this personal relationship with God was strongly emphasized. So I grew up believing that I could have a personal relationship with the God who saves me. But yeah, I think actually that really spurred me on to want to develop that relationship and learn more. And that actually brought me to the Catholic Church. So this was a very positive thing when I was growing up. And frankly, I think a lot of people grow up Catholic and don't really embrace or learn about that personal relationship.
I for certain did not.
Yeah.
It took a little bit, and I still found within Catholics, and I finally found Catholics who are all about this personal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But every time I heard that, I was just like, that's such a Protestant idea, which huge. That's not exactly the best thing about me growing up. Because I've really grown to appreciate that.
Yeah.
That, like, my Protestant friends are just like gung ho about, like, getting to know Jesus, and I'm like, I love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, we need that in the Catholic Church.
And that's another positive thing I'll say about Luther. Really, the Church is in constant need of reform, and he pinpointed certain aspects that needed reform in his day, and specifically today, our culture. Our Catholic culture needs reform in that many Catholics grow up with kind of a legalistic perspective and not really a full embrace of Catholic teaching. The Church's consistent teaching, which is about a God who desires to have a personal relationship with us and pursues us in that personal relationship. And I think I learned early on in life that ethos of accepting God's pursuit of me. I learned that in a Protestant context, and I discovered in Catholicism that coming to fruition. And when I became Catholic, it wasn't through any specific Catholic community that practiced these notions, but I found it in Catholic teaching, and subsequently I was really blessed to find those Catholic communities where there was a personal relationship and our pursuit of God as a community. But it's not something I necessarily expected to find. It was something that I thought ought to be there. And Dorothy Day said, "I love the Catholic Church not for what she is or what she appears to be, but for what she ought to be." Right? So what her destiny is, and that's why I became Catholic as well.
I think any Catholic who's honest with himself has to look at the church, especially throughout history, and even sometimes today, and you're just like, man.
Absolutely,
But
yeah.
there's also a beauty on the other side, and that's that, like, there's this brokenness of this church, and yet there's still this element of, like, despite its brokenness, there's a great beauty of what it aspires to be.
Yeah, and I think it's every Catholic's responsibility to reform the church from within. And the tragedy of Luther's life is that through a combination of his fault and the church's fault in some ways, he ended up trying to reform the church from the outside.
Right.
And, we would have had a much more, beautiful outcome if he had stayed within the church. And there were many reformers at the time, like Erasmus, like Saint Robert Bellarmine, Saint Pius V, who stayed within the church and doggedly pursued reform. And I think that's such a beautiful, heroic way to live your life, is to love the church for what she ought to be. Chesterton said, he kind of gave an analogy, your own nation, right? You don't love your nation for what it does, because our nations can fail us. They can do evil things sometimes.
You mean America's failed?
Yeah, sometimes, And so if you love something, you don't leave it as it is. He said a man's friend likes him and leaves him as he is. A man's wife loves him and is constantly trying to change him. So we do that for the things that we love, whether it's our country or our church. We stay in it and we fight to change it.
Awesome. So let's finish up. And I just want to talk a little bit about where the Catholic Church agrees with Sola Fide and, like, why it thinks it's insufficient in terms of this idea of salvation.
Yeah. Well, so going back to Luther's interpretation of St. Paul, in context, it's actually quite clear that Paul is the main theological question that Paul wrestles with, especially with the communities in Rome and in Galatia, is the question of whether Gentiles can be Christians. And he keeps talking about circumcision, and you're like, who cares, But it was a very live theological debate in his time. And that's why whenever he talks about faith alone, it's by faith that we're saved. He brings up circumcision, saying, guys, you don't have to be circumcised, especially like older men. It's a lot more painful when you're older than when you're 8 days old. I assume. I don't know. But you can edit that out.
Theology raw.
You can edit that. Oh man.
Just keep going. I think So he's not explicitly going against this idea of, like, faith versus works, but more of, like, you don't have to be Jewish in order to be Christian, right? In the context,
right? So he brings up Abraham in Romans 4, I think. Abraham before he was even circumcised. So this is important to Paul. Abraham was not yet circumcised. Before he was circumcised, he accepted God's call to him by faith. But the thing that is implied there, which Luther missed, is that Abraham expressed his faith by getting up and leaving, by actually doing what God asked him to do. This is all over the New Testament, especially in the Gospels. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And there are so many other places in the New Testament where it's quite clear that those who do perform the commandments of the Lord are those who are saved, right? And so Abraham's faith was expressed before he entered into the covenant of circumcision with the Lord, and that's Paul's point, that his faith was not reliant on the what became later the Jewish law, the Torah. His faith was reliant on trusting God and acting upon it. And so Christ brings the new covenant, the new law, which it is completely revolves around trusting in God and following His commandments. So it's independent of the Jewish law. I think this is something that, because Luther wasn't wrestling with the theological issues that Paul was, which were to do with circumcision and following the Hebrew law. Luther was wrestling with his own sort of personal issues with following the law of his day, and or in his specific Augustinian practice, discipline. And so he interpreted Paul's words in light of what he was currently going through. And I think it was an unfortunate misinterpretation which fixated on a certain truth and excluded the other truth. But the full truth is that our beliefs, our intellectual beliefs, and our actions are united. They're irreducibly united to one another, and you can't really separate the two. And I think Luther attempted to separate the two.
I think also in his day, and this is what's really interesting. When I was diving into this, and for full transparency, my like senior thesis, the thing that let me graduate college, was actually on like kind of faith alone, like looking at the Catholic position versus like Luther's position. Mm-hmm. And I looked at Thomas Aquinas, right, who's writing about 200, 300 years before Luther exists. And Thomas Aquinas actually says we are justified by faith alone. And so it's really interesting, because I always thought like, no, we're not. And then I read this, mm-hmm. the like Catholic thinker saying that like we are justified by faith alone. So it's like, where did this issue come in? Mm. And it's this idea of what's known as sanctification. Because Luther, and he's completely correct, because he's really worried that like, he thinks that the Catholic Church teaches that we are saved by our works. And the Catholic Church says, no, it is God's work. God is the one that does the saving, right? Mm. It's Jesus on the cross. It's not me serving the poor. Mm-hmm. And so he says, look, the reason I serve the poor is because Jesus has already saved me. Mm. The Catholic Church kind of says, well, yes and no. And what they mean by this, what the Catholic Church means by this is, look, it is God's work first. Mm-hmm. God is the one that like saves us, right, through his death on the cross, and through this grace that he gives us. And then we're justified. But really, justification is just a turning around, right? This idea of a metanoia. It turns our heart around. But just because we've turned around doesn't mean we've completely grown back in that relationship with God. Like, it's been healed. But the beautiful things about relationships is they can always grow and develop. So where do works come in the Catholic position? Works don't save us. Works sanctify us. Right? Works aren't the things that get us into heaven. But works are the things that kind of help get us closer to God. And the deeper theology is, it's not, we don't do the works by ourselves, but rather we do it with God.
Yeah. And
so kind of the image I like is like, think about parents painting a room. They're going to paint their 4-year-old son or daughter's brand new room. They could do it by themselves, right? And let's face it, they're going to do most of the work there. But because they love their child, they're going to say, look, do you want to help paint this room? Do you want to help out here? They'll give them the paint, and they'll let them do it, and they'll have to like fix it later on. Mm-hmm. But there's this sort of like great gift of being part of that, where objectively, do they do much? Not really. But yet their work still does something. Mm-hmm. And at the end they say, look, we're going to bring you out to ice cream after. did they actually earn that? Did they actually bring anything? Not really. But the parents, because of their love and because of this gift for their child, are like, we're going to allow you to be part of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of how the Catholic Church sees faith and works, is that God does the work, but we get to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Not because God needs us to be, but because God's such a good parent that he's like, I want you to be part of this because it's good for you.
Yeah.
I could do it alone, but I'm going to let you be part of it. I'm going to let you enter into this relationship and actually be part of my work.
Yeah.
And you look throughout scriptures, and like, Jesus could have started the church on his own.
Yeah.
But it says, hey guys, remember that time you all betrayed me? And then I died? And then none of you believed me? Yeah, you're a bunch of failures, and yet I'm still going to work through you.
Yeah. And he didn't need Mary's cooperation either. He could have just appeared on earth fully formed, but he chose to become a fetus and an infant and to grow up under the protection of this woman. And God entrusted her with that role. He didn't have to, but he specifically asked her to do that. And it all depended on her because God chose for it to depend on her. But it didn't have to be that way. And that's true of so many things in our own spiritual lives and other themes throughout Catholic theology. Having that theme in mind makes so many things make more sense. You know, God doesn't ultimately need me, but he has chosen for it to depend on me. The church today is Christ's body, is Christ's hands and feet. And it does rely on us because God has chosen to give us that responsibility. Yeah.
So any closing thoughts?
Yeah. I think that there's so much always to learn from Protestants and from Protestant theology in how to be a better Catholic. And for those of you who want to practice Catholicism as adults, and you're thinking about how you want to live and how you want to raise your family, it's so important to look to those who are in other faiths or who are separated from communion with us to learn about their devotions, and they can help us to recover Catholic theology and Catholic practice, because sometimes the church forgets. And I know growing up around Latter-day Saints here in Utah really inspired me to take my faith more seriously. And it's a call to all of us. I know that I benefited from kind of the upbringing that I had, where reading the Bible was really encouraged, having an internal spiritual life and a relationship with Christ was important. And notice that about the people around you, even if they aren't Catholic, because they can teach us a lot.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. The more each passing year, the more I kind of like look more at like Catholic Protestant relationships, and like just talking with close friends of mine, that I just look back to the Reformation. I'm just like, man, you wonder if we would have had that church council earlier during Luther's time, and that they wouldn't have just like tried to squash Luther and just be like, because he has some really good points that like legitimately needed to be addressed and talked about. Is he right on everything? No, right? He has some things wrong. But you look back and it's 30 years really from the moment that Luther posts his 95 Theses and that they have that council. And for context, I'm not 30 yet. It's a long time. It's a long.
But looking back in retrospect, it seems like a short time.
I know.
We're like, oh, it was the 16th century. That's same time period.
30 years ago, grunge was just starting out in Seattle.
30 years ago, we didn't even have YouTube. Wow.
Whoa.
So, all that to say, like, the church's time, we take the long view. And that's why I want to be a part of this church. There's a universe, it holds to universal truths, even though sometimes in practice we forget those truths. I want to attach myself to something universal and timeless. But if I'm impatient, it can be pretty frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
If I want a certain doctrine to be made more clear, if I want the church to respond to something in a certain way, it can be really frustrating, how slowly the church moves sometimes. But I really think if Luther had been more patient, even viewing the situation beyond his own lifetime, realizing that the church is going to move, is going to address these things in time, even if I don't live to see it. Taking that sort of long view, that self-sacrificial view, would have saved a lot of people a lot of heartache and a lot of pain, and even reverberating down the centuries to now.
Right. Yeah. So, kind of thing I want to leave this with is, I'm all the more inspired to really dive into ecumenical discussions and see how can we bring the Catholic, the Protestant churches, and even the Orthodox churches kind of back together, because we're meant to be one body. And there's a lot of work, there's going to be a lot of discussions, there's going to be a lot of disagreements, but I think it's worth doing, trying to find those places of unity, and make sure Christ's church is not divided but is one body. So I think this was great. This was fun.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, if you watched through this far, thank you. Hopefully this made sense. It wasn't too just all over the place.
That will depend on how much you edit it.
I'm not planning on editing really any of it. So
Theology raw.
WWE style. Let's go take a
Well, the
stroll.
actual fight is going to happen off camera.
Yeah,
throwing the chairs and that's in the bonus edition.
Yeah, if you got to subscribe, and it's
subscribe.
If you like this content, if you want more, let me know. I can. I thought about interviewing more people, just to have conversations. We'll get this YouTube channel off the ground, right? Because Catholic YouTube's definitely not a niche YouTube section.
It's gonna explode, man.
It's gonna happen.
You gotta get in on that.
All right. Well, everyone, hope you're doing well. Stay healthy and stay holy.